what really decides power in history? Is it age, the strength of armies, spiritual authority, or the ability to unite people under one command? Because in Yoruba history, a strange contradiction keeps appearing again and again. The oldest city was never the most powerful. The most powerful kingdom never united all Yoruba people. And the moment one city almost did, everything fell apart. So when people today confidently say, the Yoruba had an empire, what exactly do they mean? Are they talking about Ile-Ife, the ancient sacred city where everything began? Are they talking about Oyo, the kingdom that conquered vast territories and ruled many peoples? Or are they talking about Ibadan, the war city that dominated the 19th century through sheer military force? Or is the truth far more complicated than a single empire story? Understanding that complexity is the key to understanding the wars, betrayals, alliances, and missed opportunities that follow. It even helps answer a question many still ask today. What if the Yoruba had united before the British arrived? To reach that answer, we must first understand how power actually worked in Yoruba land. Across the world, historians use certain political terms to describe how societies were organized. A kingdom usually refers to a state ruled by a king whose authority stops at his borders. An empire is different. It is a state that expands outward, ruling over other peoples and other rulers, collecting tribute, enforcing obedience, and maintaining hierarchy. Between these two lies the vassal system, where a local ruler remains on his throne but answers to a higher power, paying tribute and providing soldiers. City-states describe independent cities governing themselves with limited territory, while confederations are temporary unions of independent states formed for defense or survival. Caliphates and emirates represent Islamic political systems that spread through conquest and religious authority. These words did not originate in Yoruba culture. They are later labels used by scholars to describe indigenous systems in familiar global terms. The Yoruba did not wake up calling themselves citizens of kingdoms or empires in the European sense. But when we apply these categories carefully, they help us see clearly how power shifted over time. Most Yoruba communities originally functioned as independent kingdoms or city-states, each centered on a main town ruled by an Oba, supported by chiefs, religious institutions, and customary laws. The king governed his people, defended surrounding villages, settled disputes, and controlled local trade. But his authority rarely stretched far beyond his immediate territory. Ijebu is a perfect example. It was a strong and wealthy kingdom, strategically positioned near the coast with control over key trade routes linking the interior to the sea. Its rulers grew rich through commerce and carefully controlled movement in and out of their territory. Yet Ijebu never marched across Yoruba land conquering neighbors. It remained sovereign, inward-focused, and fiercely independent. This pattern was common. Power existed everywhere, but expansion was rare. Only once in Yoruba history did one kingdom transform itself into something much larger. But before reaching that moment, the story must begin where Yoruba civilization itself began. Ile-Ife. In Yoruba memory, no city stands higher. Not because it conquered land, not because it ruled many people, but because it gave birth to kingship itself. According to tradition, Ile-Ife is the place of beginnings, where creation unfolded and where Odudu was settled. From this sacred city, his children and followers moved outward, founding new towns and establishing new dynasties. Oyo, Ijebu, Owo, Ijesha, Ondo, many of the major Yoruba kingdoms trace their ancestry back to Ile-Ife. Not politically, but spiritually. Because of this origin, Ile-Ife became the cultural and religious heart of Yoruba civilization. Its ruler, the Ohoni of Ile-Ife, came to be seen as the ancestral father of all Yoruba kings. Other rulers sent messengers to him, sought blessings, and performed coronation rituals connected to Ile-Ife. In this sense, the Ohoni was first among equals, a spiritual anchor, a symbol of legitimacy. But here is where many people get confused. Respect is not the same as control. Ile-Ife never commanded armies across Yoruba land. It never collected tribute from distant kingdoms. It never appointed governors in other territories. It never punished kings for disobedience. Its power was influence, not enforcement. Archaeology shows that between the 11th and 15th centuries, Ile-Ife was a flourishing urban center. Its bronze and terracotta artworks remain among the most sophisticated in African history. Its traders exchanged goods far beyond its region. Its population was large and organized. Modern scholars sometimes refer to this period as an Ile-Ife imperial phase. But this does not mean political empire. It refers to cultural reach. Ideas flowed outward. Religious authority spread. Artistic styles traveled. Legitimacy radiated across Yoruba land. But military power did not. Ile-Ife was revered, not feared. And this distinction matters, because the first Yoruba state to transform power into domination did not arise from spiritual authority. It rose through war. It rose through horses and steel. It rose through expansion. And its name was Oyo. Around the 16th century, Oyo began like many other Yoruba kingdoms, a single town ruled by a king. Tradition holds that it was founded by Oranion, a grandson of Oduduwa. For a time, Oyo was just one kingdom among many. Then everything changed. Unlike forest-bound kingdoms to the south, Oyo sat near the savannah. This geography gave it access to cavalry warfare. By the 17th century, Oyo had mastered the use of horsemen on a scale no other Yoruba state could match. This military advantage was revolutionary. Oyo armies moved faster. They struck harder. They conquered farther. The kingdom expanded beyond its homeland, swallowing neighboring territories and subduing distant peoples. Its capital, Oyo-Ile, known to early Europeans as Katunga, became the heart of a growing imperial system. By the height of its power, Oyo was no longer just influential. It ruled kings. The Ile-Ife of Oyo sat at the center of a vast hierarchy. Provincial rulers, town chiefs, and regional princes answered to him as subordinates. Some historical records speak of thousands of rulers within the empire's sphere of control. Oyo's authority stretched far beyond Yoruba land. To the west, Dahomey was forced into vassalage, sending yearly tribute that included goods and enslaved people. Along the coast, Popo states submitted. To the north and east, territories associated with the Tapa, Bariba, Nupe, and Borgu peoples fell under Oyo's influence. Even parts of Ashanti lands felt Oyo's reach. This was no single ethnic kingdom. This was empire. And Oyo built systems to maintain it. At the center stood the Ile-Ife, addressed as Kabiyesi, a title reflecting unquestionable authority. Yet his power was balanced by the Oyo Mesi, a council of 7 senior chiefs who advised him and could even force abdication in extreme cases. Across the empire, officials called Ajale supervised subject territories, collected tribute, enforced loyalty, and oversaw military commanders stationed where resistance might rise. Subordinate rulers traveled yearly to Oyo-Ile to pay homage, not as symbolic courtesy, but as political submission. Trade flowed through ports like Ajase, today known as Porto Novo, linking the empire to European networks. Tribute poured inward. Oyo's cavalry dominated the region for generations. For more than 2 centuries, no Yoruba state could challenge it. But empires rarely fall only from outside pressure. They rot from within. Cracks began to appear inside the mighty structure of Oyo, long before its enemies could bring it down. By the late 18th century, internal rivalries weakened the center of power. Political intrigue spread through the palace. Factions struggled for influence. During the reign of Ile-Ife Abiodun, the empire still enjoyed wealth and prestige, but instability quietly grew beneath the surface. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the north, a powerful military commander named Afunja rebelled against Oyo authority. His stronghold, Ilorin, broke away from imperial control. What began as political defiance soon turned into something far more dangerous. Fulani forces moved in. Ilorin fell under Fulani control and became part of the expanding Sokoto Caliphate, a massive Islamic empire spreading across northern West Africa. Overnight, Ahio lost a crucial frontier and faced a new political system entirely different from traditional Yoruba governance. As the empire weakened, subject provinces sensed the shift. Tribute stopped flowing. Local rulers asserted independence. Military loyalty wavered. Ahio's authority unraveled piece by piece. By the early 1800s, the empire was collapsing from every direction. Ahio Ile itself came under attack. The great capital that once commanded fear across the region was destroyed. When British explorers passed through in the 1820s, they found ruins where an imperial city once stood. The people scattered. Some fled south and later founded New Ahio. But the empire was finished. And its fall did not bring peace. It brought chaos. Without a central power strong enough to enforce order, Yoruba land descended into decades of warfare. Former provinces turned on one another. Old rivalries reignited. New military powers rose where imperial authority once stood. This violent vacuum would shape everything that followed. Across Yoruba land, independent kingdoms continued to exist, each defending its territory, shaping trade and guarding autonomy. Ijebu remained wealthy and cautious, controlling coastal trade routes from its capital at Ijebu Ode. Its Awujale ruled alongside councils like the Ogboni, creating a restrained system of governance that limited expansion but preserved independence. Even at the height of Ahio's empire, Ijebu had resisted conquest. It would remain sovereign until British military force finally broke its power in 1892. To the west and south, the Egba people responded to the spreading insecurity in a different way. Once scattered across many small towns in forested regions, they faced constant raids and threats after Ahio's collapse. Rather than expand outward, they turned inward and united. Around 1830, dozens of Egba settlements gathered together to form a new fortified city called Abihokuta. This was not empire. It was survival. Abihokuta had several kings representing different Egba groups, with the Alake emerging as first among equals. The city became a strong defensive center, successfully resisting attacks, including repeated threats from Dahomey. Yet its power remained protective, not expansionist. Further north lay Owu, one of the oldest Yoruba city-states, remembered in oral tradition as among the first to crown a king after Ile-Ife itself. Strategically positioned along important trade routes, especially those linked to kola nut commerce, Owu once flourished. But strength proved fragile. In the early 19th century, Owu became entangled in fierce regional struggles over trade and power. Between 1821 and 1827, a coalition of Yoruba forces, including Ile-Ife, Ijebu, and remnants of Ahio, besieged and destroyed the city. Owu was never rebuilt. Its people scattered, many settling among the Egba and Abihokuta, where the royal title Oluwu still exists today. Owu did not fall because it overreached like an empire. It fell because war consumed it. To the east, the kingdom of Ijesha remained strong but regional. Founded by descendants of Oduduwa, its ruler, the Owa Obokun, governed fertile lands that sustained its people. Ijesha warriors earned respect across the region, but the kingdom never sought to dominate others. Like many Yoruba states, it valued autonomy over expansion. Nearby, Ekiti was not a single kingdom at all, but a collection of many small independent states scattered across hilly terrain. Towns such as Ado Ekiti, Ikire, and Ikole each had their own rulers, customs, and political systems. They shared culture and language, but not centralized authority. There was no Ekiti emperor. When external threats emerged, however, they knew how to unite. In the southeast, Ondo followed a similar regional path. Founded through Oduduwa's lineage, its ruler, the Osemawe, governed locally without seeking imperial reach. Nearby Owo, positioned between Yoruba land and Benin territory, absorbed influences from both worlds. Its rulers carried the title Olowu, and its art reflected Benin styles. At times, Owo aligned more closely with Benin than with other Yoruba states. And then there was Lagos. Originally settled by the Awari Yoruba and known as Eko, Lagos later came under Benin influence when Benin forces installed a ruler whose lineage traced back to the Edo people. Over time, Lagos transformed into a major cosmopolitan port city, central to trade and European contact. In 1861, the British formally took control. Culturally Yoruba, politically distinct, none of these states formed lasting empires over one another. They traded, they fought, they allied when necessary, but they fiercely guarded independence. This pattern defined Yoruba civilization for centuries. And yet, out of the chaos following Ahio's collapse, one new power rose with frightening speed. Its name was Ibadan. Around 1829, Ibadan began not as a traditional kingdom, but as a war camp. Refugees from destroyed towns gathered there. Warriors from Ahio, Ile-Ife, and many other places settled together, united not by ancestry but by survival. The remnants of Oyo, they faced common enemies, advancing Fulani forces, pushing southward from Ilorin. Out of constant battle, the camp grew into a city. But Ibadan made a radical decision. It did not crown a king. In a land of sacred dynasties and hereditary rulers, Ibadan rejected monarchy altogether. There was no Oba, no royal lineage, no divine kingship. Instead, power rested with warrior chiefs. Leadership was earned through success in battle. The most senior and effective commander became the Bahale, and later the Balogun. This military republic was unlike anything else in Yoruba land. Though it still acknowledged the Alahafin of New Ahio symbolically, in practice, Ibadan answered to no one. It was autonomous, aggressive, relentlessly organized for war. Its rise might have ended early if not for one decisive moment. In 1840, Fulani troops advanced southward from Ilorin, threatening to push deep into southern Yoruba territory. Ibadan forces met them at Osogbo. The battle would decide the future of the region. If Ibadan lost, large parts of Yoruba land could have fallen under Fulani domination. But Ibadan won. That victory transformed the city overnight. No longer just another war settlement, Ibadan became the shield of southern Yoruba land. And with that role came dominance. After the victory at Osogbo, Ibadan surged forward like a rising storm. With the Fulani threat pushed back, nothing stood in its way. The city expanded rapidly into territories that had once belonged to the Oyo Empire. Military commanders were stationed across strategic towns. Formerly independent communities now found themselves answering to Ibadan war chiefs. Some paid tribute. Others were required to supply soldiers. Many felt, for the first time in generations, the heavy pressure of domination. By the middle of the 19th century, Ibadan's population had exploded into the tens of thousands. People from every Yoruba subgroup lived within its walls. It was no longer just a city. It had become the nerve center of Yoruba military power. Places like Ijesha and the many towns of Ekiti, which had long governed themselves, now experienced Ibadan's authority directly. Roads, trade routes, and political decisions increasingly flowed through Ibadan. For a time, the city functioned in practice like an empire. But unlike Ahio before it, Ibadan never created a formal imperial structure. There was no emperor, no bureaucratic system of provincial governors. Control was maintained by force, not institutions. European observers of the mid-19th century nevertheless described Ibadan as the most powerful Yoruba state of the era. Some modern historians later used the phrase Ibadan Empire to capture its dominance. Others called it the Ibadan Republic, recognizing its unique military government. The truth lay somewhere in between. Ibadan was a hegemony. It ruled through strength. It imposed obedience. But it had not yet transformed military dominance into permanent empire. And that unfinished dominance bred deep resentment. Other Yoruba states did not see Ibadan as a rightful successor to Ahio. They saw it as a bully, rising out of chaos to replace imperial order with raw force. By the 1870s, resistance hardened into alliance. the independent towns of Ekiti, the warriors of Ijesha, the cautious but threatened Ijebu, and other communities fearful of permanent subjugation. Together, they formed a coalition known as Ekiti Parapo. This alliance was born not of ambition, but of survival, and it sparked the longest and most destructive conflict in Yoruba history, the Kiriji War. For 16 brutal years, from 1877 to 1893, Yoruba fought Yoruba. Battles raged across towns and farmlands. Trade collapsed. Resources were drained. Families were displaced. No side could secure total victory. The war ground on in exhaustion and bloodshed, creating a stalemate that neither alliance nor Ibadan could break. And that stalemate opened the door to an outside power waiting patiently on the coast: the British. By the early 1890s, British officials stepped in, presenting themselves as peacemakers. They imposed treaties, halted the fighting, and declared protectorates across Yoruba land. In 1893, the wars effectively ended, not because either side had won, but because colonial authority had taken over. Ibadan's ambitions were frozen. So were those of every other Yoruba state. The era of indigenous power struggles had closed, and a new era of colonial rule had begun. But British domination did more than change politics. It reshaped memory. For administrative convenience, colonial officials grouped independent Yoruba kingdoms together under centralized structures. Protectorates were drawn. Later, larger regions such as the Western region emerged. To British administrators, this made governance easier. To history, it created confusion. Colonial writers often spoke of the Yoruba collectively, using broad labels like tribes or nations, without carefully explaining the old political boundaries. Over time, many readers began to assume that Yoruba land had always been a single political unit. It had not. Even the name itself tells that story. Before the 19th century, people rarely identified themselves as Yoruba in a broad sense. They identified by kingdom and town. Ahio people were Ahio, Egba were Egba, Ijebu were Ijebu. The word Yoruba originated outside the region, in the Hausa-speaking north, where Yoruba referred mainly to the people of Ahio. European explorers encountered the term there. One of the earliest recorded uses appears in the writings of Hugh Clapperton in the 1820s, where Ahio was called Yoruba. Later, writers such as Samuel Johnson adopted Yoruba as a collective name for all who shared language and cultural traditions. From that point on, identity slowly shifted, from local political belonging to broader cultural unity. But this shift did not mean that a single Yoruba state had ever existed in earlier centuries. There had been no unified Yoruba kingdom, no pan-Yoruba empire. Even Ahio at its height ruled as Ahio, not in the name of Yoruba. Colonial misunderstandings deepened the confusion. Some European missionaries and officials referred to Yoruba Oba simply as chiefs, failing to grasp the complexity of kingship. Others assumed that titles like King of the Yoruba, sometimes applied to the Alaafin of Ahio, meant uncontested control over all Yoruba land. In reality, the title reflected prestige, not absolute authority, especially after Ahio's fall. Writers such as A.B. Ellis recorded valuable traditions, but also brought European biases. Decentralized African political systems were often described as chaotic or primitive, because they did not resemble European monarchies. Groups of independent kingdoms were therefore treated as single political units. Smaller states disappeared in the historical record. Sovereignty blurred. British indirect rule added yet another distortion. Traditional authorities were reshaped to fit colonial administration. Some rulers were elevated beyond their historical roles. Others were subordinated artificially. The Alake of Abihokuta, for example, was recognized by the British as paramount over all Egba groups, including Owu communities that had historically been separate. Colonial provinces were drawn for convenience rather than historical accuracy. Ahio province even included areas like Ile-Ife and Ijesha that had never belonged to the Oyo Empire. Later generations, looking at colonial maps, often assumed those boundaries reflected ancient imperial control. They did not. After independence in 1960, pride reshaped narratives once again. As people sought strong historical foundations, language grew looser. Words like empire were used more freely. Ile-Ife was called an empire because of its antiquity. Ibadan was labeled an empire because of its dominance. Social media went further, inventing Ekiti empires and Ijebu empires. The words sounded powerful, but they were not historically accurate. In careful scholarship, precision matters. There is a difference between influence and rule, between dominance and empire, between pride and fact. When reality is sorted clearly, the picture becomes sharp. Oyo was a true empire. It ruled multiple peoples, enforced obedience, and built imperial systems. Benin was a true empire, but it belonged to the Edo people, not the Yoruba. The Sokoto Caliphate was a vast Islamic empire of the 19th century. Ibadan wielded near-imperial power for a time, but never formalized empire. Ile-Ife exercised enormous cultural influence, but never conquered. Ijebu, Egba, Ekiti, Ondo, Oyo, Ijesha, and others were strong kingdoms and states, powerful in their own ways but not empires. Understanding this does not weaken Yoruba history. It clarifies it. It reveals a civilization built not around permanent centralization, but around autonomy, negotiation, rivalry, and shifting alliances. And this clarity explains something deeper. When people debate whether the Yoruba once had an empire, they are really asking whether unity was ever possible, whether fragmentation was a flaw, or whether it was simply a different political logic. History shows that Yoruba land thrived for centuries through independent states linked by culture and origin, not by permanent domination. Only once did one kingdom rise clearly above the rest. That was Oyo. Much later, Ibadan came close, but its dominance was unfinished. Everything else existed in a complex web of autonomy. This pattern helps explain why, when colonial power finally arrived, it encountered not one unified empire, but many independent states struggling through unresolved conflicts. History did not suddenly fail in the colonial era. It followed patterns long in motion. And that brings us to one final debate that continues even today. The writings of Samuel Johnson. For more than a century, his book, The History of the Yoruba, has shaped how this past is understood. Some critics accuse him of bias toward Oyo. Others argue that he overemphasized the Oduduwa origin story. Still others claim that his missionary and colonial context influenced his interpretations. These criticisms deserve serious examination. But dismissing Johnson outright creates another distortion. Without his work, much of the 19th century oral tradition would have been lost. Many of the political distinctions that scholars rely on today would be far harder to reconstruct. Johnson was not perfect, but he was foundational. The real task is not to glorify him or reject him completely, but to understand his context, weigh his sources, and refine history through continued scholarship. That is the ground we will step into in our next video. When all of this is taken together, Yoruba history emerges not as a single straight line, but as a family of stories. Sometimes aligned, often in tension. When everything is collapsed into one imagined empire, that richness disappears. When pride replaces precision, clarity fades. But when each kingdom is understood for what it was, and each shift of power for why it happened, the past becomes sharper, not smaller. And from that sharper understanding come better conversations about unity, identity, and the present. The Yoruba world was not weak because it was decentralized. It was simply different. It produced sacred centers like Ile-Ife, imperial giants like Oyo, military republics like Ibadan, trade powers like Ijebu, defensive unions like Abihokuta, and resilient alliances like Ekiti Parapo. Each played its role. Each shaped the path of history. And together, they tell a story far richer than the myth of a single empire ever could. And before you go, know this. Yoruba land once endured a civil war that lasted 16 long years, from 1877 to 1893, tearing towns apart, draining resources, and reshaping the future. It was a conflict that only ended when British imperial power stepped in. But what if things had gone differently? What if unity had come earlier? What if leaders like Latosa had succeeded in bringing the Yoruba together before colonial forces arrived? Some historians suggest the Yoruba could have fielded an army of up to 500,000 warriors. Imagine what that might have meant for the fate of the region. Would colonization have been so easy? Would Nigeria, as we know it today, even exist? Or was unity the greatest opportunity that slipped away? That is the question we explore in the video here. What if Latosa had united the Yoruba before the British came? The answer might change how you see history forever. Watch the video here. Until then, think about the true cost of division and the power that unity might have held.